What if I told you that the world's most powerful empire didn't just rule through armies, navies, or colonies, but through narcotics? Not criminals hiding in jungles, not shadowy gangs operating outside the law, but a respectable global empire backed by banks, parliaments, and the most advanced navy on earth. For generations, we've been taught that the British Empire spread civilization, free trade, and rule of law. But hidden beneath the polished history lies a disturbing question. What if the British Empire functioned as the world's first and largest state-run drug cartel? A cartel that produced drugs at industrial scale, smuggled them across oceans, used violence to enforce markets, and relied on addiction to balance its books. This is an exaggeration. Its documented history largely ignored, softened, or fragmented in textbooks. Tonight, we're exposing the hidden mechanics of how Britain built, defended, and profited from the largest narcotics operation the world had ever seen, and how its consequences still shape global power today. But to understand how this happened, we must start with a paradox. Because the British Empire didn't turn to drugs out of greed alone. It did so out of desperation. By the late 1700s, Britain had a problem, one that threatened its entire imperial system. China for centuries. Europe had been obsessed with Chinese goods, tea, silk, porcelain. British demand for Chinese tea alone was exploding. Tea wasn't a luxury anymore, it was a daily necessity for workers, soldiers, and elites alike. But China wanted nothing from Britain. The Qing dynasty operated on a strict worldview. China was the center of civilization. Foreign goods were inferior. Trade was allowed only on China's terms. So the British paid for Chinese goods with silver. Year after year, ship after ship, silver flowed out of Britain and into China. This created a massive trade deficit, one so severe that British elites feared economic collapse. Silver wasn't just money. It was the backbone of the global financial system. Losing it meant losing power. The East India Company, Britain's most powerful corporate entity, was under immense pressure. It ruled India, commanded private armies, and answered directly to Parliament. But even it couldn't solve the China problem, until someone proposed an unthinkable solution. If China wouldn't buy British goods, Britain would sell China addiction. The drug already existed, opium. Used medicinally for centuries, opium wasn't new. What was new was scale. In British-controlled India, particularly Bengal, the East India Company had direct control over land, farmers, and production. So the company transformed opium from a local crop into an industrial commodity. Here's how the system worked. Indian farmers were forced to grow opium instead of food. The East India Company bought the opium at fixed, low prices. The opium was processed, packaged, and auctioned. Private British traders smuggled it into China. Chinese silver flowed back to Britain. Officially, Britain claimed it wasn't responsible. Unofficially, the entire system was designed, regulated, and protected by the British state. This was not a rogue operation, it was policy. By the early 1800s, millions of Chinese citizens were addicted. Entire communities collapsed. Productivity fell. Families were destroyed. Chinese officials warned the emperor, opium is poisoning the empire. They weren't exaggerating, but Britain had solved its trade deficit. Silver was flowing back. The empire had discovered something more powerful than gold. Eventually, China fought back. In 1839, the Chinese government confiscated and destroyed massive quantities of British opium. They banned the trade. They arrested dealers. Any sovereign nation would do the same. Britain's response: war. The First Opium War wasn't fought over freedom, diplomacy, or defense. It was fought over drug profits. British gunboats armed with the most advanced naval technology in the world obliterated Chinese ports, cities, and defenses. China didn't stand a chance. The result was the Treaty of Nanking. China was forced to open ports. British merchants gained legal protections. Hong Kong was seized. Opium trade expanded. And when China resisted again, Britain returned with allies in the Second Opium War. More cities burned. More humiliating treaties were signed. China wasn't just defeated, it was subjugated. At gunpoint, Britain forced an entire civilization to accept mass addiction as the price of peace. At this point, the comparison becomes unavoidable. This wasn't free trade. It was narco-imperialism. By the mid-1800s, the scale of Britain's drug operation was staggering. Opium revenues funded colonial administration taxes from opium stabilized British India's budget. British banks, insurers, and shipping firms all profited. This wasn't happening in the shadows. It was openly debated in Parliament. Some politicians objected, calling it immoral and destructive. But morality lost to math. Opium revenues were simply too important. Here's the crucial insight. The British Empire didn't just tolerate the drug trade, it depended on it. Without opium, India's finances collapsed, Britain's trade deficit returned, imperial expansion slowed. Drugs had become the financial glue holding the empire together, and like all systems built on addiction, the profits masked growing instability. The damage was no longer containable. In China, tens of millions were addicted, social order collapsed, rebellions erupted. The Qing dynasty weakened, setting the stage for what Chinese history still calls the century of humiliation. In India, farmers starved after being forced off food crops. Famine followed, resentment toward British rule exploded, and globally, Britain's moral authority eroded. Hypocrisy became impossible to hide. How could an empire claim to spread civilization while enforcing drug addiction at gunpoint? Public opinion slowly shifted, but empires don't abandon profitable systems easily. By the late 19th century, Britain attempted reforms. Commissions were formed, regulations were proposed, gradual reductions were promised. But the truth was uncomfortable. There was no clean exit. The empire had wired its finances, governance, and global trade networks into narcotics. Ending the trade meant admitting moral failure, economic dependence, imperial guilt. So the system limped on, scaled back, rebranded, and obscured. Only when global power shifted, when the US rose, and colonial rule weakened, did Britain finally retreat. Not because it wanted to, but because it had to. Now comes the unsettling part. Because this story isn't unique, it's a pattern today. Drugs still flow from poor regions to rich markets, addiction funds, political systems. Violence enforces economic arrangements, financial institutions profit indirectly, moral language hides economic reality. The tools have changed, but the logic hasn't. When economies rely on debt instead of silver, financial dependency instead of colonies, sanctions instead of gunboats, the structure looks different, but the power dynamics rhyme. History doesn't repeat, it repackages. So what should we learn from this hidden history? Takeaway number 1. Empires don't collapse because they're evil. They collapse because they become dependent on destructive systems. Opium didn't just poison China, it hollowed out Britain's moral and political legitimacy. Takeaway number 2. When profit overrides ethics, violence becomes policy. The Opium Wars weren't accidents, they were enforcement mechanisms. Takeaway number 3. Systems built on addiction always demand expansion and eventually break. Whether drugs, debt, or speculation, the pattern is the same. The British Empire didn't fall because it sold opium, it fell because it couldn't stop. That's the real lesson. So the question isn't whether modern systems are better. The question is, which addictions are we defending today, and what are we willing to destroy to protect them? If this video changed how you see empire, power, and free trade, like the video, it tells the algorithm this history matters. Subscribe for more hidden economic history the textbooks won't touch, and comment below. Do you think modern global systems have truly moved on, nor just found cleaner language for the same strategies? History is only hidden until you look directly at it.